Are you wondering whether the Linux Foundation's new AI-powered security project is actually going to protect your open source stack, or whether it's just another corporate initiative that sounds good on paper? And do you want to know why an AWS engineer is raising alarms about a Linux kernel regression that's cutting PostgreSQL performance in half? If so, you're in the right place. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what's changed in the kernel this week, which distribution just shipped after a 3-year wait, and what the Akrites project actually does and doesn't promise to fix. Let's get into it. Linus Torvalds announced the first release candidate for Linux Kernel 7.2 this past Sunday. That means the 2-week merge window has closed and the testing phase begins. Now, before we talk about what's new in 7.2, there's something you need to understand about where we are in the kernel cycle right now, because it's a bit unusual, and we'll come back to that in a moment. For 7.2, the headline changes are genuinely interesting. The AMDGPU driver picks up initial HDMI 2.1 FRL support. That's fixed rate link, the higher bandwidth mode needed for 4K at 144 Hz and 8K displays. Intel's Xe driver gets initial CRI platform support, and there's CPU model number support added for Intel's Panther Lake R series. On the file system side, large folios are now enabled by default for Btrfs, a memory management improvement that reduces overhead when working with large files. There's also a notable cleanup. Linux 7.2 has finally eliminated the strncpy API from the kernel entirely. That might sound minor, but this has been 6 years in the making, over 360 patches, to remove a deprecated string copying function that was a known source of subtle bugs. It's done, and the ShedX framework continues to evolve. The extensible scheduler, which lets you implement custom scheduling policies as BPF programs without recompiling the kernel, got its latest round of improvements merged. Final release of 7.2 is expected in the second half of August 2026. Now, here's the part I mentioned we'd come back to. Linux kernel 7.0 reached end of life on June 27th. To be precise, this is the 7.0 stable series, the short-lived branch, not the kernel 7.x line as a whole. Greg Crower-Hartman made the announcement. The last update was 7.0.14, and that branch is now done. No more patches. Short-lived branches like 7.0 are only supported for a couple of months until the next mainline release takes over. The current stable branch is 7.1, released June 14th. But this EOL comes with a complication that's worth paying attention to. An engineer at Amazon Web Services filed a report showing that Linux 7.0 cuts PostgreSQL throughput roughly in half compared to earlier kernel versions. The culprit is a specific change in how the kernel handles certain I/O patterns. A simple revert isn't on the table. The current thinking is that PostgreSQL itself may need to adapt to the new kernel behavior. So if you compiled and installed kernel 7.0 yourself and you're running PostgreSQL, that's worth knowing. If you're running a distribution kernel from Fedora, Ubuntu, Arch, or similar, your distro's kernel team manages the update path, and you should check their release notes rather than kernel.org directly. For those who want long-term stability, the current LTS branches are 6.12, 6.6, and 6.1, all actively maintained on kernel.org. On June 25th, the Linux Foundation announced something called Akrites, and I want to be precise about what this is, because the framing matters. Akrites is not a new security tool. It's not a scanner you install. It's a coordinated industry response to a specific problem. AI models can now scan a major open source project and surface vulnerabilities in minutes. That capability used to require weeks of expert human analysis. It no longer does. The problem that creates is not that vulnerabilities get found faster. That's actually good. The problem is what happens next. When multiple organizations independently scan the same project with AI tools, you get a flood of uncoordinated reports hitting the same maintainers, sometimes with conflicting patches, sometimes for the same issue. Maintainers, many of whom are volunteers, get buried. Akrites addresses that by establishing a single shared security incident response team and a standardized coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. The founding members include AWS, Anthropic, Cisco, Google, IBM, JP Morgan Chase, Microsoft, NVIDIA, OpenAI, Red Hat, and others. One detail worth noting, Akrites commits to acting as maintainer of last resort for critical packages that have no active maintainer. That's a meaningful commitment. Whether Akrites delivers on that at scale remains to be seen. But the structure is sound, and the problem it's addressing is real. On June 29th, Mageia 10 shipped. If you're not familiar with Mageia, it's an RPM-based Linux distribution with roots going back to Mandrake Linux, one of the most popular desktop Linux distros of the early 2000s. Mageia is run entirely by volunteers through a Paris-based nonprofit. No corporate sponsor, no enterprise edition. It releases when the community decides it's ready. The last release was Mageia 9 in August 2023, nearly 3 years ago. Mageia 10 ships with Linux 6.18 LTS, KDE Plasma 6.5.5, and GNOME 49. Both Plasma and GNOME now default to Wayland sessions out of the box. A first for Mageia. The package manager moves to DNF5, which rewrites the dependency resolution logic in C++ rather than Python. Faster resolution, more stable transactions. The toolchain is GCC 15.2 and LLVM 20.1. Rust 1.95 ships, and the project has committed to keeping Rust updated throughout the support lifecycle. A few practical notes. Chromium is no longer packaged natively. The maintenance burden of tracking Chromium's 4-week release cycle was too much for a volunteer team. Flatpak is the recommended path. Firefox ESR 140 is still available as a native package. And MP3 encoding has moved from the tainted repository into the main core repo. The last Fraunhofer patent expired in 2017, and Mageia has now cleaned that up. Mageia 10 also supports 32-bit x86, one of the very few 2026 Linux releases that still ships 32-bit images. So that's the week. A new kernel release candidate, an EOL that comes with a PostgreSQL performance warning, a coordinated industry response to AI-accelerated vulnerability discovery, and a distribution that took 3 years to ship and delivered something solid when it did. If this was useful, hit like, it genuinely helps the channel. Subscribe if you want this every week, and if you want to go deeper, sign up at tondoslinux.com. Subscribe.